Let's talk about a story that back in 1861, right on the edge of the Civil War, peeled back the curtain on a totally different kind of American battlefield. This wasn't a war fought with cannons, but one waged in the fiery, smoke-filled furnaces of industry. We're diving into Rebecca Harding Davis's groundbreaking work, Life in the Iron Mills. This story was a bombshell. It was part of a new movement called American Realism, which was all about showing life as it really was, gritty and raw, no sugarcoating. So together, we're going to walk through its haunting world, meet its tragic artist, and really wrestle with the question it leaves burning in the smog. Right from the opening lines, Davis throws us straight into the fire. There's no gentle introduction. It's just this raw cry of despair. And this question, is this the end? It's not just a fancy opening. It's the question that hangs over every single page, every character, every cloud of smoke. It's the core mystery the story dares us to solve without ever promising we'll find an easy answer.
To really understand this story, you first have to try and breathe its air. The town here isn't just some passive backdrop. It's practically a living, breathing monster. And like the slide says, its one defining feature, its entire personality, is smoke.
Davis is a master at making you feel this environment in your own lungs. The air isn't just dirty, it's suffocating. It's clammy. She describes it as being thick with the recycled breath of too many people crammed into one space. It's designed to be overwhelming, to make you feel completely claustrophobic. It stifles. And just listen to the language she uses here. The smoke isn't just floating around. No, it's an active invading force. It rolls sullenly, like it's angry. It settles over everything, creating black, slimy pools. It covers the buildings, the river, and, most importantly, the people, coating them all in this greasy film of soot. And this is what that environment does to a person. The smoke doesn't just sit on the worker's skin, it seeps right into their bones. Davis calls them masses of men, like their individuality has been completely erased. Their faces are dull, besotted, their bodies are begrimed, and the very air they breathe promises vileness for soul and body. It's just this devastating portrait of what it means to be dehumanized. But, and this is so important, out of this dehumanized mass, Davis pulls out one single, individual soul. Our main character, Hugh Wolfe. He works at the furnace, but his spirit, his inner life, is the total opposite of the grime he's trapped in. Hugh is different, and everyone knows it. He's sensitive, he's not as physically strong, and he has a taint of school learning. So what do the other workers do? They mock him. They give him the nickname Molly Wolfe. In a world where brute strength is the only thing that matters, his artistic soul is seen as a kind of feminine weakness. He's an outcast, even among the outcasts. So what does this artist use for his art? He doesn't have marble or clay. He uses coal, literally the garbage, the waste product from the very industry that's slowly killing him. And look at how Davis describes it, a delicate, waxen, flesh-colored tinge. The irony is just staggering. He is literally sculpting beautiful human things out of industrial trash. And this is his masterpiece, a sculpture of a working woman. Now, it's not beautiful in that classical, delicate way. It's muscular, grown coarse with labor. It's real. But it is absolutely vibrating with this one powerful feeling, a deep, painful longing. And her face, it's described like a starving wolf's, embodying a hunger so intense it's almost violent. Okay, so here's where the story really ignites. This raw, private expression of pain is about to be discovered by men who live in a completely different universe. One night, a group of visitors, the mill owner's son and his buddies, they wander in and stumble upon Hugh and his statue. And right here, you see this massive gap between two worlds all in one room. On one side, you have the visitors. They're clean, they're comfortable, wearing overcoats, smoking cigars, talking about philosophy. And on the other side, you have the workers, half-dressed, covered in filth, doing back-breaking labor in this hellish heat. I mean, they're in the same physical space, but they might as well be on different planets. So each of these visitors looks at the statue and at Hugh, and they see it through their own filter, and every single one of them fails him. You've got Kirby, the owner's son, who's a pure capitalist. To him, his only job is to hand out a paycheck on Saturday. End of story. Then there's Dr. May, who gives these empty speeches about self-improvement, completely blind to the fact that Hugh can't just choose to be something else. And then there's Mitchell. He's the only one who actually sees the hunger in the statue. He gets it. But he's just a spectator. He feels for a moment and then moves on, offering no real help.
And when they ask Hugh, what does it mean? His answer is just, it's so simple and it's devastating. She be hungry. And when they don't get it, he says this crucial line, not hungry for meat. This isn't about an empty stomach. This is a hunger of the soul, a hunger for art, for knowledge, for beauty, for a life that's more than just surviving.
So this whole encounter, this tiny peek into a world of ideas and comfort, it's like a spark in a tinderbox. That hunger, now that it's been spoken out loud, becomes unbearable, and it leads directly to the story's tragic breaking point. This is where his cousin Deborah comes in. She's a hunchbacked woman who loves Hugh with this fierce, almost painful intensity. She overhears the visitors talking, and she thinks money is the magic key. So in this desperate act of love and misunderstanding, she steals Mitchell's wallet. She genuinely believes this is the thing that will finally unlock the life Hugh deserves. So Hugh finds the money, and now he's faced with this impossible choice. He knows it's wrong, it's theft, but the story forces us, right alongside him, to ask a much bigger question. What does the word thief even mean when your whole life, your hopes, even the clean air have already been stolen from you? And here's how he justifies keeping it. It's an incredible moment. He basically redefines the whole act. It's not theft, it's taking back what's rightfully his. He argues that wealth, just like the air we breathe, was meant by God for everyone, not just for a lucky few to hoard. It's this radical, desperate idea born from a lifetime of having nothing. He's caught, and his sentence is 19 years. Just let that number sink in. 19. For that one desperate act, the system hands him a punishment that is, for all intents and purposes, a death sentence. Faced with the horror of slowly wasting away in a prison cell for 2 decades, Hugh makes his final choice. He takes a piece of tin and sharpens it, and he carves into his own body, the same way he carved beauty out of the coral. It is his last and his only act of real freedom. A tragic way to finally take control over a life that was never really his. So, Hugh's personal story is over, but the questions he represented, they are far from over. The narrator makes us sit with the aftermath, with the legacy of his unfinished work. After Hugh dies, there's this one little glimmer of something that isn't totally bleak. Deborah, after she serves her time, finds a peaceful life with a kind Quaker woman, a life with clean air and quiet faith. And maybe most importantly, Hugh's art survives. The narrator saves the coral woman from the mill and keeps her, hidden away in his home. And in the end, it all comes back to the statue. This rough, unfinished thing made of industrial waste outlives its creator. It becomes the story's permanent conscience, a constant, nagging reminder of a life defined by that mighty hunger. And so, we end exactly where we began. The face of the coral woman is forever asking that first and final question. Is this brutal, short, starved life really all there is? Is there nothing beyond this? The story doesn't give us an answer. It just leaves that terrible, vital question echoing, long after the last of the smoke has cleared.